Welcome right in to Fantasy Points DFS Early Look, your first edition for the 2023 season, bringing it back from last year, just new and improved, just like everything else with Fantasy Points here in the year 2023. I, of course, am your host with the most time on his hands. I am Thomas Tipple. You can find me at Thomas. Joining me is the man that handles the DFS tasks here at Fantasy Points. It's Jake Tribbey at Jake Tribbey on X. Still think it's an amateur porn site, but either way, Jake, you are firing early for week 3, giving people what they need. The Monday Night Football games, as we're recording this, have just kicked off, and yet we're still already looking ahead to week 3. Fantastic. Article drops tomorrow. I cannot wait to get into this. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, well, Thomas, I think, first and foremost, I think we got to start with a Fantasy Point subscriber winning the Millie this week.
Yes.
The 555 taken down by, I believe, Russell Miller
Yes.
with an incredible lineup. I mean, a Brock Purdy team. Purdy only scored 14.7 DraftKings points, still took home $1 million. Played Kyron Williams, who just awesome adjustment based off that news. I think a lot of people were discounting this Rams backfield, even with Cam Akers, listed as a healthy scratch. I think they announced that at around 12:30. A lot of people didn't adjust. He only ended up being 6% in the 555 millionaire maker. Also played Zach Moss, who we were very high on as a DFS value.
Right.
But it was a pretty strong pivot off of Josh Kelly, who was very chalky. Keenan Allen, another guy we just absolutely loved. His volume's been great. Debo, everyone was citing Debo versus zone, Ayuk versus man here at fantasypoints.com. The Rams run a ton of zone, and Debo Samuel drops 22 DraftKings points. And then, of course, Puka Nacua, only 11% in the 555 millionaire maker. I mean, this was a guy who I think everyone thought would have been super popular, ends up on the injury report midweek with an oblique. That probably drove things down a good amount. Combine that with, perceived difficult matchup against the 49ers defense. Also had Darren Waller in there, who, 13.6 fantasy points may not seem like a lot, but for, tight end in week 2, that was actually a pretty strong score. And then Tony Pollard, who ran way under expectation, and I think 32 or 33 expected fantasy points, only ended up with 19.9 DraftKings points, but it was still enough to get him there, combined with the Cowboys defense. I mean, incredible team. I want to say this is our first subscriber to ever win $1 million. So really great stuff from Fantasy Points. I thought it was an awesome week from me, from Scott, from Graham, from everyone involved in the DFS product. I had a bunch of lineups that were close but not quite, and I kind of had the thought midday Sunday. I was like, well, if I'm doing well, I feel like I hit on a lot of the right players, just none of the right combinations. Maybe a subscriber or 2 or 3 really crushed, and it turns out, one of the Millie winners ended up being a Fantasy Point sub. So great way to start the season, I got to say.
Yeah, it's insane. And shout out to him for he played Zach Moss, which I know, look, and that's guest on a Fantasy Points podcast, Zach Moss. You can go back and listen to that. I mean, his fantasy value is generally not deemed very high. He's very jaggy in terms of, but the way he was used throughout this game, even when Richardson went down, was kind of what we should have been expecting. So I definitely didn't play enough Zach Moss. So shout out to him. And I mean, Robert Woods 2.0 here in Puka Nacua. Just an unbelievable play. Can't wait for him to be 9,000 in a couple of weeks. I mean, enjoy the cheap Puka Nacua days now, because they're going to be gone, gone forever. So insane. I absolutely loved it. I think we should get into some of these plays this week. We're going to take a quick second. When we come back, we're going to peep the screen and talk you guys through some of the best plays for week 3. Sit tight. Look at those clean transitions. All right, Jake, lead the way, quarterbacking his way against an insanely favorable matchup.
Yeah, so, there are a lot of quarterbacks that I think look interesting this week. I mean, obviously, Anthony Richardson is still aggressively underpriced, but, he's dealing with a concussion, so still not sure if he's going to suit up. But I think the guy who's going to be mega chalk this week is going to be Kirk Cousins. And he's, generally been one of the more matchup-sensitive quarterbacks in football, but he faces the Chargers in week 3. First of all, this game has a total of 54.5, which is 3.5 points higher than the Kansas City Jacksonville total last week, easily the highest total of the season. So, Vegas says this is a game you're going to want to be on. And if you've watched the Chargers defense, I mean, you're going to want to target quarterbacks against them. They've allowed 438 yards per game. That ranks last. 356 passing yards per game, also last. And 10.3 yards per attempt, which isn't just last, it's 12% worse than the second worst team. They're PFF's third worst graded coverage unit, and they've allowed the league's highest completion percentage over expectation. And of course, for fantasy football, they've allowed the second most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks thus far. I mean, every opponent has just diced up the Chargers, and I don't expect that to change this week. Vegas doesn't. So yeah, that's why we're going to end up playing quite a bit of Kirk Cousins in week 3.
I think Justin Jefferson might have 700 yards by the time week 4 rolls around. It's going to be absolutely disgusting this week. I think you're right. I think Cousins is the play. Like DraftKings and Fanduel, not a huge difference between the two prices. I think he's very affordable. I think there might be some quarterbacks played a little bit more, but when you look at the guys like even Patrick Mahomes just struggling a little bit, I think more people will gravitate to him by name value. I think you're going to get some value here with Kirk Cousins. I mean, if you look at the board, you have Tua, Fields, Herbert, Lamar, Allen, and Mahomes, and a lot of those guys have struggled. So the fact that Fields is still priced higher than Cousins is insane to me. So this is where you take advantage of some of those early season values, because Fields should not be, and it takes a little while for them to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think just looking through these higher priced quarterbacks, I mean, none of them are playing in games that are remotely as juicy as the one Cousins is playing in. In games with a total of 52 or higher, Cousins has averaged 26 DraftKings fantasy points per game. That would have ranked third best among slate eligible quarterbacks last season. So it just seems like a smash play, but I'm sure the field will be on it. Should be pretty popular. I'd be shocked if he wasn't.
Right. You don't want to miss out on that one. So we have our man Kirk Cousins. Now a guy who I love and have loved for a long time, and we're finally seeing the fruits of our fandom come to fruition here. Tony Pollard. Let's talk Tony Pollard. Plays the maybe good, but remembered they're tanking Arizona Cardinals. I mean, 28-7 against the Giants, but you look at how Saquon was able to handle them basically just in the second half. We should expect big things from Tony Pollard this week.
Yeah, absolutely. I think running back is pretty wide open this week. A lot of really good options. But why wouldn't you want to play Tony Pollard as a 12.5-point favorite? I mean, we know the Dallas defense is suffocating. I'd be pretty surprised if Arizona is able to keep this game competitive. And one of the best parts about Tony Pollard right now is that he's just getting absolutely insane usage in pretty much all circumstances. Great receiving work. He already has 12 carries inside the 10-yard line, which matches his 2022 total. He's right around 75% of backfield XFP, which last year would have translated to about 18.5 expected fantasy points per game, which would have been good for RB3. But of course, we know Tony Pollard is extremely efficient. So, if Tony Pollard can get in around 18 to 20 expected fantasy points per game, I mean, he's going to exceed that expectation by at least 3, probably closer to 4, 5, or 6 fantasy points. I mean, we could be looking at one of the best running back seasons since 2000 out of Tony Pollard. If this usage continues, he's really looking like a league winner. The only problem is that, he's 8,000, and because of the great stat expected fantasy points, everyone's kind of caught up to his elite usage. So, kind of similar to Kirk Cousins, I would expect Pollard to be pretty popular, but at the same time, because there are a lot of good options at running back, I don't think he's going to be crazy high owned, and he might just be a guy that you have to lock in this week.
It's a matchup where people might think themselves out of playing Tony Pollard because it could be a blowout. But if you look at week 1 against the Giants, they were in a not favorable weather game. They were still giving Tony Pollard the ball into the fourth quarter. So I don't think he's coming out. Vaughn isn't it. You can clearly tell that when he's out there. I mean, they're giving Turpin touches out of the backfield. The number 2 just isn't there. So you're right. We could be seeing just ungodly usage from Tony Pollard, and he should be smashed in every lineup. I still get that fear that they're going to trot Ezekiel Elliott out onto the field when they get inside the 5-yard line. Like my heart stops for a minute. And then I remember he's not on the team anymore. And we're happy again immediately thereafter. The next running back you have out here has been a little disappointing, but we just got word Montgomery going to be out. So talk me into putting Jahmyr Gibbs into my lineup after being unable to trust the Detroit Lions offense.
Yeah, obviously, the usage wasn't what we wanted early in the season, but David Montgomery is dealing with a bone bruise, thigh bruise. He said he was week to week. He said it would take a couple weeks for this to heal. Dan Campbell called him day to day. So I suppose there is still a chance David Montgomery could play this week, but it does look very unlikely. And really all Gibbs needs, I mean, we know he's really good. Like if you watched him in prime time, if you've seen any of his touches, he looks great with the ball in his hands. All he needs is a modest usage bump to become an RB1. He's already at 11.4 expected fantasy points per game on a snap share of 37%. So that's already really strong usage relative to a snap share. And what's really important here is that after David Montgomery got hurt at the end of the third quarter, Gibbs posted a 65% snap share and 73% route share in the fourth quarter. If he sustained that over a full season, you compare that to, running backs last year, 65% snap share would have been top 12, 73% route share would have been top 3 among running backs. So, if Gibbs is able to sustain that usage over even just a full game, I mean, he's going to be an absolute monster with the ball in his hands. The matchup's fairly neutral against Atlanta. So, if Montgomery's out, I would expect Gibbs to be fairly popular, and, it's easy to see why.
Yeah, I just really need them to not play Reynolds. I don't know. Montgomery went down, and you're okay. This is Gibbs' game now, and then the first touch immediately went to Reynolds. So you're just hoping that a guy that the Lions GM room, the war room, went nuts for when they drafted him, finally touches the ball. If not, I don't know what it's going to do for people in Gibbs. I don't think people are going to take it too well. The next back is someone that I'm interested to hear you talk about because we mentioned him early. He was part of the Millie takedown here. It's Zach Moss, but he plays Baltimore, and not so great matchup for running backs, especially with Richardson out. That's running QBs open up lanes for running backs. They have to respect it with Minshew in. Talk me through Zach Moss.
Yeah, so Moss was like the premier bell cow of week 2. 98% snap share, which is just absolutely insane. He was the only Colts running back to play a snap. I mean, this team has no interest in Deion Jackson, who lost 2 fumbles and averaged 1.3 yards per carry in week 1. Keep in mind that last season, there were only 2 instances of a running back earning a 98% or higher snap share, and only 20 instances of a running back earning a snap share over 90%. So the Colts have tremendous faith in Zach Moss. I mean, the receiving role probably won't be there, but snaps are one of the top 3 most important metrics for running backs, and Zach Moss is just going to be out there all the time. I think the big wild card with Zach Moss, obviously you stated the matchup. That's not great. But the big wild card is Anthony Richardson's status. You could certainly argue that Richardson playing in this game would increase Moss's rushing efficiency. But I think if you're looking to play Moss this week, you kind of want Richardson to sit. Minshew is a capable backup, and crucially, he's not going to steal goal line carries. Anthony Richardson had 2 red zone rushing touchdowns last week, and it seems as though the team is extremely willing to run him. I mean, maybe they won't be as willing if he's coming off of a concussion, but he's a major vulture. You can kind of think, 2018, 2019 Josh Allen as a good comparison there in terms of Anthony Richardson's goal line usage. But the bottom line is that at 5,500, RB22 over at DraftKings, Zach Moss is just way too cheap relative to the 98% snap share. And I think this play, it can really just be that simple.
Right. Like I said, you don't have to overthink it, right? We do that enough. And I think that's a fine play. It allows you to stack in some other spots to tie it in. Receiver can be a little bit tricky, but I love the receiver. The first receiver we're going to talk about that you picked, because we talked about Keenan Allen kind of in the beginning. Now we're going to get his running mate, who we thought maybe would see his snaps decline with Quentin Johnston around, but That hasn't been the case. Mike Williams is still Mike Williams because he's healthy. So let's talk Mike Williams. He gets a great matchup here against the Vikings. Talk to me.
Yeah, so obviously this is a game that we're gonna want to just stack the heck out of. I mean, Justin Jefferson is tremendously expensive, 9,300, and of course he's a great play. We know Keenan Allen's a great play too, but in terms of finding the best salary value relative to a player's usage, at least in this game, I think it's probably Mike Williams or maybe another receiver that we're going to talk about later. But last week, Williams was 7th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points, 3rd in air yards, and 4th in first read targets. His volume was slightly better measured by expected fantasy points than Keenan Allen's, and he's 1,600 cheaper. And obviously, the matchup is incredible. Last season, Minnesota was the single softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing outside wide receivers. That said, Mike Williams is playing a little bit more in the slot this season, but I mean, this game's just going to have a ton of points and you're going to need to save salary somewhere because, the superstars in this game are just going to soak up such a high percentage of your salary cap. So yeah, I'm going to look at a lot of Mike Williams, whether as a run back in Kirk Cousins stacks or just in my Justin Herbert double stacks.
Yeah, I think you absolutely have to, especially if you're stacking that game. I think Mike Williams is, especially after the big game Keenan Allen just put up, I feel like maybe more people might gravitate to him. Little lower ownership on Mike Williams. We should be all systems go. I can't wait to talk about the next wide receiver. I mean, look, other shows that I do, other conversations I've had, Scott, Nico Collins was my guy in the offseason. To see him absolutely pop off, Stroud looks way better than I thought he would, if I'm being completely honest with you. But you have 2 here. Let's talk, I think, a position I don't think many of us expected to talk about in 2023 this early, but the Houston Texans wide receiver room, Nico Collins and Guru's guy himself, Mr. Tank Dell. Let's talk about some Texans wide receivers.
Yeah. So the bottom line with these guys is that they're seeing great usage. Houston is a terrible team, and they're going to need to throw quite a bit every week, and they're just way too cheap. Nico Collins was the wide receiver 15 by expected fantasy points in the final 9 weeks of 2022. So far this year, he's at 18.5 expected fantasy points, 113 receiving yards per game, and a 41% share of the Texans' air yards. Those numbers last season would have ranked 7th best, and 6th best. Obviously, if this keeps up, I mean, we need to consider Nico as a top 12 fantasy wide receiver, but he's priced as the wide receiver 25 on DraftKings this week at just 5,300. And then, obviously, Tank Dell. This is a guy that I think is just electric after the catch. He really didn't show up much last week. In week 1, didn't play a ton, was playing behind Noah Brown. Noah Brown now on IR. The coaches said he was going to play more in week 2. And well, we saw him score 20.2 fantasy points on a 17.8 fantasy point expectation. He finished with the 2nd most first read targets on the team behind only Nico Collins. Brett Whitefield described this guy as a natural playmaker with the ball in his hands. Volume is really the only obstacle for Dell, and now he's a full-time player. I mean, it's hard not to love at 3,600. I would expect both these guys to be super popular, whether in game stacks or just as one-off plays. But man, I mean, they're both just way underpriced. And, Stroud in the final 3 quarters of his week 2 game, I thought looked pretty good. I know some of our film guys were commenting similar. So, yeah, I really like these Texans wide receivers. We can forget about Robert Woods and, just play the young guys, Nico and Tank.
Yep. I have nothing to argue against there. I think that those are great calls. This next one, though, I'm going to need you to sway me on because every time I watch him play football, it hurts me. So we have KJ Osborne because, again, like you mentioned, we're stacking this game. And with how expensive Jefferson is, this is a cheap option to get in on. KJ Osborne. Some people might have thought we were about to talk Jordan Addison, but instead you're turning the tables and going Osborne. Talk to me.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I heavily considered Addison. I think if you're stacking this game, you're probably going to end up with a good amount of Addison. He's averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game this year, which is obviously great, but Jordan Addison has ran way better than his expectation. KJ Osborne's usage has actually been 38% better than Addison's. He's averaged the 31st most expected fantasy points per game, ahead of Devonta Smith, Brandon Ayuk, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I mean, no one's talking about it, but Osborne's volume has actually been really good. Of course, we can expect Jordan Addison to slowly eat into KJ Osborne's volume, as we know Addison's the better player, but I'm not sure that matters a ton in week 3. I mean, we're not going to see a drastic shift in playing time between Addison and Osborne headed into this game with the Chargers that, like we said, is extremely juicy. The Chargers have allowed the highest yards per route run, most yards per target, third most air yards, third most end zone targets this season, on top of by far the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. You're going to need to save salary somewhere here. I already highlighted Mike Williams, but he's 6,000. It's hard not to like KJ Osborne if you're double stacking Cousins just as some salary relief, even triple stacking. We're going to need some cheap guys in there. And yeah, I really like Osborne.
He fits the bill. I think I just love Addison so much. It's hard to.
Addison's going to be way more popular is my thought, at least early.
Right. And I don't see a reason why he can't hit a decently long touchdown. And really, that's all you're really looking for in these games with such cheap options. Speaking of cheap options, a guy that I didn't even really expect to play football this year. But not only is he playing football, he's demanding targets at an obscenely high rate, which I don't understand after watching Trey McBride catch one crossing route. It should have been clear that your next pick, Zach Ertz, should not be gaining this many targets, but he is. And as you mentioned, it's gross. But let's talk to the people through Zach Ertz.
Yeah, it is. It is really gross. I spent a lot of time thinking about tight end, who I would write up here. But, to me, the best option just seemed very clear. It's Zach Ertz. I think a lot of people are going to be excited to play TJ Hawkinson in this game stack. But, I mean, he's 6,500. And here's the thing. Zach Ertz's volume, measured by expected fantasy points per game, has been better than TJ Hawkinson's. Obviously, Ertz has run under expectation, but still, among tight ends with multiple games, he's first in targets, first in air yards, and fifth in route share. Even his 9.9 fantasy points per game still ranks 8th best among slate eligible tight ends, but he's priced as the tight end 15 on DraftKings. And the other part of this play that I think is really important is that after Rondale Moore, Zach Ertz has the lowest average depth of target on the Cardinals. And the Cowboys are pressuring opponents at a 70% rate that so far this season, according to Fantasy Points data. I mean, Joshua Dobbs, he's probably going to take 15 sacks, but he's also going to have to get the ball out very quickly. And Zach Ertz is the guy for those short area targets. I mean, you could do a lot worse at tight end than Zach Ertz, as gross as it is.
I 100% agree. And no matter how bad we keep saying the Cardinals are going to be every week, they seem to march the ball into the red zone. Now they get Dallas, as you said, it's probably just going to go absolutely ballistic. But all you need is one. If you get one touchdown and it happens to come from Ertz this week and not Connor, you are in the money at that tight end spot with how much money you're saving. There's very few options that are cheaper, like Conklin, Kincaid, and Musgrave. I mean, even Taysom Hill is just $200 cheaper. Out of all these options, nobody is hitting like Zach Ertz is. So I think you've absolutely nailed this. I think this is great.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, I think, all these other tight ends have just major question marks with their usage. I want to play Chig, I want to play Kincaid, but, I think their usage is just going to have a lot more variance than a guy like Zach Ertz, who's, consistently seeing, 7, 8, 9 targets a game. Yeah, you could do a lot worse at 3,500. I have a feeling, Ertz is going to slowly creep up in price here over the next few weeks, just because it doesn't seem like Arizona wants to throw the ball to anyone else.
Right. Yeah. Hollywood just punching air right now. That's for sure. We're going to take a quick second. We come back. We're going to get final thoughts, lead into the article, and we are going to get you guys out of here. Sit tight. Jake, give people the rundown on the article. It's popping out tomorrow and what you can expect before we get out of here.
Yeah, so the week 3 DFS Early Look will be available at fantasypoints.com. Should be up by noon. That's, kind of my first, like we went through in this video, my first look at the slate. Who's the chalk going to be? Who are some of the top plays? Gives you a really good early sense for how things are going to look. And we'll have a bunch more great DFS content throughout the week as we get more information. I mean, obviously you don't want to start making lineups yet, but you definitely want to start thinking about it, especially if you want to be the next Fantasy Point subscriber to win $1 million.
Right. And with the Fantasy Point subscriber winning $1 million, what more reason do you have to put off subscribing and getting all the information that you need from fantasypoints.com? Look, for your host, the most time on his hands, I'm Thomas Tipple. Joining me, Jake Tribbey, the man himself. Enjoy the rest of your week and get locked in for DFS week 3. This was your DFS early look. Till next time.